The fourth, but really it's an equal first issue as to why people favour local provenance is to conserve local character. So it's one of the, well, practically equal first issues. But I don't remember having read anything much about it. I think this is probably something which resonates with people, but there's not a lot documented. To me, it matters that we retain our spindly, dull-looking, green-flowered Coria reflexa, for example. I rather like that. I mean, it's not something that you would put in a garden to showcase to people as to how beautiful our local plants are. The local spinebills and insects might feel differently, but it's part of the local character. It's something special about the east of Melbourne that's a bit different from the lovely red-flowered plants you find elsewhere. So I found this a hard one to come up with any examples with or anything. So does anybody on the stage who are more into the genetics of things have anything to say about this concept of how we want to retain something of our local character?
It's obviously, there's a bit of a value judgment there, and it's critically important. In a sense, it goes beyond the science. But I think it is important to realise that what's local now may not have been local a few hundred years ago or a few thousand years ago. You know, we do live in a changing environment. And of course, you know, what we're about is the fact that the environment is changing all the more rapidly and is going to change pretty dramatically in the next 50 years. So in a sense, we face a situation as scientists, and I think as a community in general, where the plants that are suitable locally now are not going to be suitable in 50 years' time. And, you know, the predictions are pretty horrific in terms of potential contraction of ranges, potential expansion of regions of other species. And I think we have to accept that. We have to accept the fact that the climate is changing. We have to accept the fact that what may be suitable local now may not be suitable local in the future. And that, of course, is a challenge, because all of a sudden you may not be able to maintain your local character. And, you know, that's, I mean, I love local character as well, don't get me wrong, but, you know, every time I go kayaking down the Yarra and I see the weedy invasions happening, I just think this is kind of scary. And where's that local character gone on the banks of the Yarra that was certainly there 10 or 20 years ago?
All right. Have we got anything on Vox Vote?
I'll just ask a new question.
Good.
What species do you think has local character? Just get in there and add your species.
And another one, if you wouldn't mind, Amanda, can you recommend any publications or sources of information where people have articulated this concept? Because it really struck me. But it's an equal first, effectively, of the reasons why we choose local provenance. It's something that we can't ignore. It matters to me. I love my local green-flowered Coria reflexa, and I'd like to see it stay. But it's not science. It's something that nevertheless needs to be dealt with. So if anybody's got any good articulation of that issue, that would be useful to know. Okay, somebody really wants to say something? Thank you, Ari. And again, I'll get you to tell us who you are, please.
Hi, my name's Shana. I'm not used to hearing my voice this loudly. I've just started working as a consultant and recently looking at a landscape design plan done by a landscape designer for a new residential subdivision in Western Melbourne. The trees that were recommended to be planted were salmon gum from Western Australia, maple from Northern America, spotted gum from New South Wales, and cultivar of snow gum. So, but when it was presented, it did look like it was preserving local character. There was gum trees, and it was nice colours, and for the average punter, it would have looked, for all intents and purposes, like it was local character. So I think, I don't know if this is the same issue as genetic provenance from a restoration point of view, because it's very dependent on what you're looking at it, from what perspective you're looking at it. Are you looking at it from like a residential area or an area of bushland? Is there any way that we can work out where we're wanting our character to be developed. Is it in the streetscapes? In which case, along St Kilda Road, you think, well, London plane trees is the local character of St Kilda Road. So I think that's a very individual question.
If I may, Jeff Yukovic here, that Shana's question raises a very fundamental issue here, which is the choice of species itself, more fundamental than provenance, because in much revegetation and landscaping, the species are wrong for the site. They're not actually the original species that occurred on the site. And this mistake happens more often than provenance problems. So local character is essentially preserved by using the right species. And we mustn't lose sight of this fact that most revegetation projects have this problem of inappropriate species. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Amanda, do we have any other issues on this? No, then it's time to move on. Thanks very much for those contributions, but we do have one more. We'll take
Sorry.
Introduce yourself too, please.
Oh, hello. My name's Ken. I'm from Bendigo, and I run a little Indigenous nursery. Conserving local character. I think what's interesting is that we're actually looking at this topic looking backwards, in that we're looking at what has happened in the past. Just a very simple local observation I've had in Bendigo. We grow a little saltbush, Ontralana tomentosa. In the drying climate we've had in the last 20 years in Bendigo, we're severely impacted by loss of rainfall. We've seen a lowering of the amount of grasses, and that niche, if you like, has now been filled with things like ruby saltbush, creeping saltbush, which are now advancing southwards in the last 10 years. We don't have a choice in this, I don't think. It's just moving of its own volition. Is there any thoughts on the matter? I'd like to think we're talking about choice at the moment. We don't have much of a choice in this matter. How do you feel about we're looking towards the future of climate change? What do we feel about the choices that we don't have?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think we really need to acknowledge actually how much influence we can have. And I'm a great believer in letting things happen in lots of cases, because as interferers in ecology, we're not very good. You know, we often don't do it very well because, like Ari said, we have very imperfect information. So one of the ways to do it is to actually set up your own little experiment and keep a watch on it. And if you're feeling that things are going towards weediness, have the consideration about taking something out. You know, we talk a lot about putting stuff in, and then we go, oh, well, that didn't work, but we don't really consider about the taking out and the replacement process if something is not tracking how we would like it to track or how we think it should be tracking.
And look, there's another really interesting tool. If you're concerned about how things change and natural changes, and as Linda says, letting things go with the flow, keeping in mind obviously that our activity are not letting that flow work as well as it could. But if you are concerned about change, there's a fantastic scientific branch of literature that I suggest you can explore, where now for a very, very long time they've been taking all around the world pollen cores in suitable areas and looked and using those pollen cores through the substrate, which can then be dated. Looked that the scientists across the world have been able to look at the changes, the dramatic natural changes in vegetation, even in the last 5,000-6,000 years. So those changes, those remixes, those rearrangement happen all the time.
All right. Is there anything more
Yep.
on Vox Vote? There is.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions around the role of nurseries play in this kind of local character, and whether or not there needs to be some sort of regulation around Indigenous nurseries and better regulation about understanding what local provenance is and where provenance is coming from. And there's also a question around the commercialisation of species, and does that restrict genetic diversity? And we're worried about one thing, but the commercialisation actually restricts genetic diversity in revegetation works. Can people comment on that?
I suppose
there is a bit of a divide between what's desirable horticulturally and what's desirable if you're putting plants in with the idea that they're part of a population that's conserving genetic diversity that may interact with other things. Because that issue about the planting, the landscape plantings in that west of Melbourne area, that's looking for a particular landscape effect rather than also using that opportunity to plant Indigenous species that may then be retaining part of a distinct gene pool, or even just providing connectivity. So I think there is a difference between the genetics that's useful for horticulture, where you want reproducibility, you want to know what to expect in terms of plant form, whereas if you're planting a wider genetic base within a species or within a revegetation, then you don't mind if some plants are smaller and some are larger, that some take longer to flower. It may be that those smaller plants can survive the harder times, more dry times better, but the larger plants may set seed more and contribute to a seed bank. So yes, I think there is an issue. It depends on your perspective for planting.
Right, now we're running short on time. Oh, and David Cameron now. That'll take half an hour. David, could you be quick, please?
Just while David's gearing up. I think the issue of who owns the actual genes is an important one, and it's going to grow in the future. And you've only got to think about Tasmania now laying claim to Tasmanian devils, and no one else is allowed them. So we have this issue that's developing. So of course they were on the mainland. Can Tasmania actually claim those devils as their own? And I think in plants we're also going to see these sorts of issues coming up.
Yes, my name's David Cameron. I'll try to be as brief as I can to appeal to our... This is terrible. Can I maybe use that?
No, we're a bit further away.
Sorry. I think some of the comments that have just been made call into question whether people have enough understanding of the issue of equilibrium in vegetation, particularly under processes of change such as already had good examples with climatic changing, and the fact that there's some kind of successional process. When you're starting from scratch with revegetation, most people don't necessarily take into account that some of those even admittedly good local provenance native plants will assume a degree of dominance because most vegetation goes through a very dramatic series of stages before it reaches local equilibrium. And I've been very frustrated when people don't understand that native species, such as the 2 species of Bergen that we have in Melbourne, are treated as if they're a weed when they're native because they've responded to a set of changes in the landscape processes which have given them the opportunity to be essentially secondary or even primary colonisers, trying to be, as Lindley Smith has so beautifully and elegantly called it, nature's band-aid. So we've often got situations where a species, as several examples have been given, I'm not talking about Pittosporum, which is a true invader into the Melbourne region, but was probably native as close as Western Port at the time of settlement. I'm in the camp that says, like David Ashton and others, that it was native as far west as the wetlands that surrounded Western Port, which have now been totally eliminated. We have no chance of understanding what it did in that landscape at the time of settlement. But for species that are locally native, such as Bergen, such as Cassinias, such as a number of other species which, when you disturb things over long periods of time or suddenly invoke a new set of climatic changes, some species will have to be very dominant before things settle down. That's not the issue to do with the Coria or with the Grevillea, which is to do with mixing gene pools. I'm simply saying that if we fight this tendency to have high dominance by certain species in the earlier stages before we reach some kind of equilibrium with a changing climate, we'll be forever setting the clock back to the beginning of that cycle and fighting it for no good reason. We've got to understand that overdominance by some species is part of a successional process. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. And for the rest of you, David and I are mates, and I don't really mind him contributing. He's always a very good contributor and always very thoroughly too. So thank you very much, David. All right, we'll move along, but I'm going to leave you with a challenge. If you feel up to it, I think it would be great to have in the literature something that expresses these very common views that local character is an important reason for growing local provenance plants. And Indigenous, the Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association's newsletter, would be the ideal place to have it published.